When we think of evil leaders, I think our minds almost automatically default to like comic book villains.
Oh, absolutely. The cartoon monster.
Yeah, exactly. We picture this monster in a cape, rubbing their hands together in some secret lair, just driven by this chaotic desire to watch the world burn. But what if the most dangerous leaders aren't monsters at all?
Right. What if they're ordinary?
Disturbingly ordinary. And what if our own human biology is actually hardwired to seek them out and put them in charge?
It's a terrifying premise, honestly, but if you look at history, I mean, it's really the only one that actually explains how these regimes take hold. We tend to think of authoritarianism as this freak accident of history, but it is actually a highly predictable chemical reaction.
And welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive. Today is Friday, April 10th, 2026, and our mission today is to figure out how to stop that reaction.
Stop it before it starts.
Exactly. We are exploring how societies can create these robust, systemic, ethical filters to catch dangerous, totally unqualified leaders before they can abuse power and just dismantle a democracy.
Which is incredibly urgent work right now.
It really is. And to do this, we are pulling from Jorn Larsen Lindmann's urgently relevant book, Evil Leaders: Preventing the Rise of Totalitarian Rulers.
And Lindmann's core argument here is that we need to reclaim the word evil, not as some, vague religious concept or a moral judgment, but as a clinical analytical tool.
A diagnostic tool.
Right, because you cannot design a filter to catch a toxin if you completely refuse to understand its chemical makeup.
That makes a lot of sense. And now, before we jump in, I do want to establish a very clear ground rule for this deep dive.
Good idea.
Lindmann's book touches on highly charged political themes, right? Authoritarianism, the undermining of democratic institutions, the rhetoric of political leaders. So our goal today is not to endorse his viewpoints or to take any political sides, left-wing or right-wing.
No, not at all.
We are simply acting as your guides, impartially reporting on the concepts laid out in the text so we can all understand the mechanics of power and leadership.
Exactly. We're looking at this strictly through the lens of, like, structural engineering and psychology. How do systems fail? And how do we design them to actually withstand pressure?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if a societal crisis is just the backdrop, the system still needs someone to exploit it, right?
Right, the opportunist.
Yeah. So what is the specific psychological profile of the person who steps into that void? Because according to Lindmann, these destructive leaders, they don't just drop out of the sky.
No, they don't. They're entirely manufactured by circumstance.
Yeah.
And Lindmann introduces this framework that he calls the triangle of evil.
The triangle of evil. Okay.
Yeah. He posits that absolute authoritarian rule just cannot materialize unless three very specific forces converge at the exact same time.
All three.
All three. First, you need a societal crisis. So that's prolonged economic instability, maybe deep cultural anxiety, or just total political paralysis.
Okay, that's one.
Second, you need a leader who is completely obsessed with power.
Right.
And third, you need a vulnerable, disillusioned population. If you remove even one side of this triangle, totalitarianism simply fails to launch. It falls apart.
Wow. Let's focus on that second point for a second. The leader. Because Lindmann maps out a very specific psychological pathology for this type of person.
He really does.
He introduces a term that I found absolutely fascinating, RX syndrome. And he doesn't just mean they're arrogant, right? He treats it as a literal biological condition.
Yes.
What exactly does RX stand for?
It stands for Authority Reward Expectancy Syndrome.
Authority Reward Expectancy.
Right. Lindmann uses this term to describe a state where a leader's brain chemistry has been fundamentally altered by the exercise of power. It is an addiction in the literal neurochemical sense of the word.
That's wild.
When a person with this specific psychological vulnerability exerts dominance and wins, their brain releases this massive surge of dopamine.
So it's basically no different than a gambler hitting a jackpot or someone taking a narcotic.
The mechanism is identical. It's the exact same reward pathway. And just like any substance addiction, tolerance builds up over time.
Oh, of course it does. So they need more.
Exactly. Early in their career, winning a minor policy debate might provide that dopamine hit. But over time, the receptors downregulate. They need larger, way more extreme demonstrations of control just to feel secure.
So power is no longer just a tool to achieve some public good.
No. Acquiring power becomes the entire biological imperative. It is the only goal.
Which explains the escalation. Because if you are chemically addicted to authority, any threat to your authority isn't just a political problem. It triggers literal neurochemical withdrawal
Precisely. You hit the nail on the head. That is exactly why the paranoia sets in.
Wow.
A leader with RX syndrome, they begin to view basic democratic opposition, like a critical press or a dissenting judge, not as a normal part of governance, but as an existential threat to their actual survival.
Because it's threatening their dopamine supply.
Right. And this addiction to dominance invariably leads to repressive actions, because repression is literally the only way they can guarantee their next fix of absolute control.
You know, it makes me think of this triangle of evil like a forest fire.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, think about it. You have the societal crisis, right? Say a decade of economic stagnation. That is the dry brush on the forest floor. It's been accumulating for years, creating the perfect conditions.
Same meeting.
Right. Then the vulnerable, anxious population, that's the oxygen blowing through the trees. And this leader with RX syndrome, they're just the spark.
That is such a crucial distinction. We spend so much time analyzing the spark. We obsess over the leader. But a spark landing on a green leaf in a healthy, damp forest, it just burns out.
Right. Without the dry brush and the oxygen, the spark is completely harmless.
Exactly. Authoritarianism can't catch fire without all three.
Which brings up a really uncomfortable reality, honestly. If the leader is just the spark, the oxygen is, well, it's ordinary people.
Yeah. It is the most unsettling part of Linden's thesis, by far. If the power-obsessed leader is merely the catalyst, we really have to look inward.
Yeah.
Why does the population provide the oxygen instead of just stamping out the spark? When a crisis hits, why do our natural human ethical filters fail us so spectacularly?
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I have to push back on this a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
We are living in 2026. We have unprecedented access to information. We literally have global history in our pockets and armies of independent fact checkers.
True.
So why do modern, highly educated populations still willingly trade their freedom for perceived security? Like, why haven't we evolved past these primitive caveman instincts?
Well, because we are still operating on the exact same biological hardware that kept early humans alive on the savannah tens of thousands of years ago.
Really? Even now?
Even now.
Yeah.
Having a smartphone doesn't rewrite your central nervous system. Lemon explains that our evolutionary blind spots are profound, and they are incredibly easy to weaponize.
So you're saying the traits that kept us alive back then are the exact vulnerabilities that doom us right now?
Yes. Think about the human brain during a moment of intense fear. When early humans encountered a predator like, say, a tiger in the bushes, the brain initiated this massive shift in resources.
Fight or flight.
Right. The highly evolved prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for nuance, logic, and long-term planning, it literally powers down to conserve energy.
Oh, wow. It basically goes into safe mode.
Exactly. Safe mode. All cognitive energy is routed straight to the amygdala, the primitive fear center of the brain. Because in that moment, you don't form a committee to debate the socioeconomic impact of running away from the tiger.
Right, you just run.
You default to three basic survival instincts: strict loyalty to your immediate tribe, intense suspicion of any outsider, and immediate deference to the loudest, strongest person yelling run.
That makes so much sense. So when a society hits that dry brush phase, like a severe economic depression or a global pandemic, the collective amygdala basically takes over.
Yes. And leaders with RX syndrome instinctively know how to exploit that. They intentionally trigger that tiger in the bushes reflex.
They make us terrified on purpose.
Exactly. They use mass psychology to frame political opponents not as fellow citizens who just have different ideas, but as literal existential threats.
Wow.
When an opposing political party is framed as a literal danger to your family's actual survival, compromise doesn't feel like politics anymore. It feels like a suicide pact.
That is chilling. And Lindemann grounds this in history too, right? He brings up Hannah Arendt's famous concept, the banality of evil. But she wasn't just coining a catchy phrase, she was observing this very specific mechanism of compliance.
Right. Arendt's observations during the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the major organizers of the Holocaust, they're central to this whole idea.
Yeah.
She realized that the most terrifying thing about totalitarian systems isn't actually the handful of sadistic architects at the very top. It is the widespread compliance of completely ordinary people.
Right, because Eichmann wasn't this cartoon monster.
No. He was a remarkably average bureaucrat. He spoke in cliches and mostly just wanted to advance his career.
He compartmentalized. He focused on the logistics of the train schedules rather than the horrific human reality of where those trains were actually going.
And that is the exact banality that Lindemann is warning us about. Destructive systems require ordinary people to just suspend their critical reflection.
Just look the other way.
Yeah. Cognitive dissonance allows citizens to accept terrible things. They rationalize these small breaches of norms. They adapt to increasingly aggressive language.
So they might say, well, the leader's rhetoric is extreme, but my taxes are lower, or she's breaking the law, but honestly, that's what we need to restore order right now.
Exactly. They accept the dehumanization of the out-group because it makes them feel safe inside the in-group.
They are actively providing the oxygen to the fire, but they genuinely believe they are just keeping their families warm.
That's a perfect way to put it. And that is precisely why human ethical filters fail. You just cannot rely on a crowd's innate goodness or intelligence when evolutionary fear and mass psychology are the ones gripping the steering wheel. Biology is going to betray democracy every single time.
Man. So if our biology makes us this vulnerable to manipulation, we clearly cannot trust our gut.
Not at all.
We have to design external systemic filters, like guardrails made of concrete, not just good human intentions. So how do we move from diagnosing this problem to actually preventing it?
Well, Lindemann argues that the erosion of democracy is almost never a sudden event. It's a gradual trajectory. And because it's gradual, it produces very clear diagnostic warning signs.
Red flags.
Right. We need systems designed to catch these specific red flags.
So what do those red flags actually look like on the ground?
There's a very predictable sequence. It almost always begins with leaders attacking the legitimacy of elections, sowing doubt about the very mechanism that grants them power in the first place.
Okay, that's step one.
Next, they attempt to undermine independent courts, usually by replacing impartial judges with loyalists. Then they portray the free press not as a critical pillar of society, but as an enemy of the people.
Right.
And the final, most dangerous red flag is the systematic dehumanization of their opponents in their rhetoric.
So using words like vermin or disease.
Yes, linguistic distancing. It is a highly calculated technique to essentially lower the psychological barrier to violence in the minds of the population.
Okay, so assuming we see these red flags, which obviously we do, what structural filters actually catch them? What actually slows down a leader with Rx syndrome?
Lindemann points to the institutions we often just take for granted. Strict term limits, for example.
Right.
They are not just quaint traditions. They are structural mechanisms designed to forcibly break the dopamine loop of Rx syndrome before it becomes terminal.
Oh, that makes sense. You cut off the supply.
Exactly. Absolute judicial independence creates a wall that doesn't rely on the biological blind spots of the electorate. But, as Lindemann notes, institutions are ultimately still staffed by people.
Right. A court is only as strong as the judges actually sitting on the bench.
Which is why he pairs that institutional strength with a massive overhaul of education. Because education is how you thin the oxygen. He argues that critical thinking, media literacy, and self-reflection absolutely must be elevated to core curriculums. You have to train the brain to recognize when its own amygdala is being hijacked.
So you can snap out of it.
Yeah, allowing citizens to pause, take a breath, and re-engage their prefrontal cortex before they succumb to that emotional manipulation.
But Lindemann doesn't just rely on courts and classrooms, right? He introduces a much more modern and, frankly, a pretty controversial concept for a systemic filter.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is his introduction of modern technology into this age-old philosophical problem.
Yeah.
Lindemann proposes utilizing natural language processing and artificial intelligence as an early warning system for democracy.
An AI ethical filter. How would that even work in practice?
So the AI would be designed to process massive data sets in real time. We're talking political speeches, social media broadcasts, legislative proposals, and even behavioral trends of public officials.
That is a lot of data.
It is. And it would be trained to detect the subtle underlying linguistic shifts that always precede authoritarian action. For instance, the AI could flag when a leader's rhetoric shifts from "we disagree with their policies" to "they are destroying our way of life."
Wow. So it's scanning for those disgust markers and the in-group, out-group tribalism we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
It acts like a societal smoke detector. It doesn't actually put out the fire, but it screams when the rhetoric starts smoldering into dehumanization.
Yes.
It quantifies the danger, so it can't just be easily dismissed as, oh, it's just politics.
That is the exact intention.
Yeah.
It removes the human emotional bias from the diagnosis.
But hold on, we have to talk about the obvious risk here.
Oh, absolutely.
An AI system constantly monitoring the speech of politicians and analyzing public discourse. That sounds dangerously close to the ultimate authoritarian surveillance tool.
It really does.
How do we build this without handing the very leaders we are trying to stop a custom-built weapon of repression?
It is the razor's edge of his entire proposal, and Lindemann fully acknowledges this paradox. For this to work, the AI would have to be radically transparent, completely open source, and managed by independent, non-state entities.
Like who? Universities?
Yeah, perhaps international academic consortiums. And it must strictly remain a diagnostic tool.
So it flashes the warning light on the dashboard, but it never, ever has the ability to grab the steering wheel.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this AI proposal really emphasizes Lindemann's ultimate thesis. Defending a democratic society is an exhausting, ongoing responsibility.
It never ends.
Never. You do not simply draft a constitution, establish a Supreme Court, and then go to sleep. It requires immense vigilance across all three sides of the triangle of evil.
Right. You have to manage the societal crises so the dry brush of anxiety doesn't pile up on the forest floor. You have to monitor your leaders to catch that Auric syndrome before it escalates. And you have to educate the population so they don't default to their evolutionary fear responses.
Because the toxins are always present in the environment. They don't go away. The filters must be maintained constantly.
So what does this all mean in a practical sense? It means that totalitarian systems are not magical anomalies. They are enabled.
Yes, they are allowed to happen.
They are enabled by economic desperation, by decaying institutional guardrails, and most fundamentally by ordinary people who just look the other way. Building ethical filters means confronting our own biological vulnerabilities just as aggressively as we enforce term limits.
And understanding these mechanisms is your personal shield. When you know how fear is weaponized to bypass your logic, and when you recognize how the banality of evil operates in everyday compliance, you inoculate yourself.
You become immune.
Exactly. You ensure that you do not become the vulnerable, reactionary oxygen that fuels the fire.
It shifts the responsibility from the system right back to us. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, a question that kind of extends Lindemann's technological proposal.
Okay.
We talked about using AI as this objective smoke detector for dangerous political rhetoric, but AI systems are not naturally occurring, right? They are programmed by humans.
Flawed humans.
Exactly. Humans who, as we've explored today, are deeply wired for tribalism, deference to authority, and profound evolutionary blind spots. So if we attempt to build an AI to serve as our ultimate ethical filter, how do we guarantee the filter itself doesn't inherit the biases of its creators? When we write the code, who actually gets to decide what a warning sign looks like?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
If the architects are biologically flawed, ensuring the alarm is perfect might be the hardest design challenge of all.
Who guards the code that guards the society? Think on that, and until next time on The Deep Dive.